So welcome back, and I would now like to introduce you to Catharine Hydon. Some of you may have heard from her first session, Taking Time to Take Care, tuning into educators' wellbeing earlier this morning. For those who didn't, the recording will be available to you on the PD in Your Pocket webpage later this week. Catharine is the Director and Principal Consultant at Hydon Consulting. Over the last 10 years, she has worked at a range of organisations and governments to understand and articulate quality and inspire change. With a Master's in Early Childhood Education, Catharine has extensive experience in the early childhood sector, beginning as a teacher in a kindergarten programme in northern suburbs of Melbourne, to lead roles in a range of services and projects for children and their families. Welcome, Catharine.
Thanks, Rochelle. Great to be here once again. And for those of you who I was hanging out with a bit earlier this morning, great to see you back again. And we do have the chat function. So please say a few words in the chat. Say hello to each other. I can see that some of you are introducing yourself, which is fantastic. Tell us who you are. Where you work, which family daycare service you work in, and you might want to shout out to your colleagues and encourage them to participate today. As Rochelle says, I've been working in early childhood education for a long time now and had the very, very good fortune of working alongside family daycare educators in several iterations of my career. So that's been a particular highlight for me. Great. Thank you very much, everybody who's starting to say hello in the chat. So keep doing that. Now, I'm going to share my screen as we get going. And I just wanted to remind you all that I will be making these slides available. I forgot to say that in the last session. So it's really good to be able to say that up front so that you know that you don't have to take huge amounts of notes. But if you do take some notes as you progress today, it's really fantastic. Good to be able to take those and then share them with your colleagues. So yeah, keep going, everybody. Introducing yourself and which family daycare service you work at. And you might want to tell us a little bit about some of your perspectives around children's rights too, because that's the subject matter that we're going to talk about today. So before I get going and talk a bit more about that, I wanted to pause and acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country I'm on here. Again, you might want to do that in the chat as well. I'm here on the lands of the Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to particularly pay my respects to elders who have helped us understand what it means to teach and learn on country. And also, it's amazing the incredible work that's happening out there. And this week, I've had the very good fortune of hearing the Narragansett Wally Award winners present and talk a little bit about their work. And congratulations to all of those people. Love to see a family daycare service being nominated in that space. So you never know. Those of you who are undertaking really strong work in that space might want to consider connecting with the Narragansett Wally space for Reconciliation Australia. So thank you for everybody who's saying hello in the chat. Keep going and shout out to everybody. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions as we go too. So you might want to share those ideas in the chat and share your perspectives. One of the things that we're going to focus on today is the ways in which people enact children's rights. So you might have some really practical suggestions, so that we'd love to hear about those in the chat. So as I said today, what I wanted to talk to you today about is the idea of enacting children's rights. So thinking about children's rights and their agency in early childhood settings. And of course, for us, it means that we're talking about what children's rights looks like in family daycare. And for me, this is a very important conversation for us to have. It's a conversation that we need to have in whole communities. And for many of you, the children's rights conversation might be something that you talk a lot about. You know, it's part of your the language you use when you talk to families and indeed to children. But generally in the Australian community, we don't talk enough about children's rights. There is sometimes a caution about children's rights too. People are thinking, oh, I'm not sure what that means exactly. And our Australian community doesn't really talk enough about rights generally. So we want to probably have conversations around that, what that means and how we understand it in the context of family daycare. It's an important part of the National Quality Framework, and we'll reference that as we go. But I do want to also be very practical, and I want to think about what a children's rights context looks like very practically in the work that you would do every day and connected to those that work. So let's power on and have a think about what we mean. So in the first instance, it's helpful for us to think about what the actual Convention on the Rights of the Child is about. So Really important document. I don't expect you all to have read it in detail because it's quite a legal document, but there are some really good resources on a range of different websites, particularly the UNICEF's website, that really help you understand what it is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is and how it relates directly to our work. So the first thing to do is to say, well, what is this document? So the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one of the most ratified conventions in the global context. So this is very good news. There's many, many countries around Australia, around the world, who have ratified the convention. And that means that they have taken it to their own governments, and there has been formal ratification of the process to agree to enact those locally. It was adopted and open for signature and ratification in 1989 and came into force in 1990. So it's actually quite old now, if you think about it. And it's been around for a little while. It's been around for the whole entire time of many of your careers in early childhood education and care. It is important also to note that there are different obligations within that context for governments, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. And let me just be really clear about this from the get-go, and it's important in our everyday context of our family daycare. The convention applies to all children, every single one, birth to 18. So for us in the early childhood space, birth to 5, birth to 8. For us in family daycare, it means that the children, all of the children that you work with, babies, toddlers, 3 and 4-year-olds, children in the early years of school, children in their more senior years of school, children with additional needs, children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, the whole lot, all of those children, every single child has rights. And whatever their ethnicity, their race, their religion, their abilities, whoever they are, they all have these rights articulated. They're a powerful statement about what we want and believe for children. Every nation across the world except for one has signed this convention. You can have a bit of a think about which nation hasn't signed the convention. You might want to do a bit of research about that. And that means that we commit to no child being unfairly treated on any basis. So for some of you, this means that as you welcome children into your family daycare homes, it is about making sure that every child, and the way you look at them, and this goes to the image of the child that you hold, as that they are seen by you and by us as rights holders, that they have an expectation that we as educators see them as rights holders. Now, just let me clarify that for a little moment. It's not that children are going to come to your front door and say, hello, my name is Catharine and I'm a rights holder. You probably need to work a little bit on children's understanding of their own rights, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go. But it is an expectation, if you like, in the background, or something that we would assume responsibility for when we relate to children, that we would see them as rights holders, and that every single child, irrespective of who they are, where they're, what language they speak, what their gender is, what their parents do for a living, whether they're rich or poor, they all have these fundamental children's rights, and that we would be responsible in our family daycare context of upholding those rights. Now, you can't really do that unless you know what they are. So it's important that we start to sort of explore that a little bit and say, what are these rights? And can I just point out some of these documentation here? This is UNICEF Canada, and UNICEF as an organisation, both in Australia and various parts around the world, as well as UNICEF globally, have produced a range of different resources around children's rights, which I encourage you to have a look at, because there are fantastic things. You might want to print out posters like this, put them around your family daycare home, and they also help children to engage in the ideas. So I would be encouraging you, as you undertake your work in family daycare, is from time to time engage children in conversation about what we mean by rights. And I'm going to clarify that a little bit further as we go. So 3 dimensions of children's rights in this space. The first ones are about survival and development rights. So this is basically what children need: food, shelter, clean water, education, healthcare, leisure, recreation, play. So there we go. We're already in a space that we know well. This is about children's right to survival and right to develop. Now, of course, for many children that we work with, food and shelter is not an issue for them. But for some children, it is an issue for them. So food security for some families is an issue for some children and families in particular communities. Shelter and a home, a permanent home and secure housing sometimes is issues for children who live in the Australian community. It is a challenge sometimes for us to examine the children's rights landscape when we are surrounded by lots of advantage. But it's important for us as early childhood professionals to consider where children's rights might be being eroded and how we can defend them and how we can support children to have their rights exercised within the context of our family daycare settings. So there's a big chunk of the work in children's rights that are about survival and development rights. The next sort of collection of rights are all about protection rights. And absolutely, this is the business of family daycare educators. This is about making sure that children are safe. They are safe from cruelty, neglect, exploitation, and any abuse at all. So we do a very good job of this. We have a national quality standard which orientates itself very strongly to children's rights and also to making sure that children are kept safe. So all of the work you do in relation to the everyday support of children accessing your family daycare home, those risk assessments you do, the conversations you have about medical plans for children, this is all in this space. And these are also making sure that you abide by child safe standards. We have some national child safe standards now, and we have attention to child protection matters. We want to make sure that we give children the protection that they need as they access online spaces. There's a whole range of places that we're trying to protect children and keep them safe. So that's the second section. So if you think about your work now in family daycare, and if you're thinking about your everyday work, you're already in the survival and development space because you're providing them with clean water and great space for children to grow up in. You're providing educational context, leisure and recreation. You might be supporting children's cultural understandings. This is about their growth and development in a healthy way. You're definitely in the protection space because you're making sure that children are safe on a regular basis. You're abiding by regulations and expectations, policies and procedures that you all know about. The last section of the children's rights space is children's participation rights. So this is about children's agency. So this is about this connection with children's agency. It is about children's agency, but more than that. It's about children having their freedom to express opinions and to be participant members of the communities of which they are a part. So this is not to say that children are waiting to participate when they get older. They can participate from birth. And that means that they get opportunities with your support to be a part of things, be a part of the world in which they live. They might go to the park with you and they might meet some other family daycare educators and other children there. And you say to them, we're going to pick up some rubbish with our tongs because we believe in safety. And we pick up some rubbish and we put it in the rubbish bin because that's the way that we can participate. You might want to go to when you pick up children from school, potentially, that children are participating in making sure they safely cross the road. So this is about everyday participation. Now, of course, we do that in a really micro way sometimes when children cook with you, that they get to stir the bowl, they get to be a part of some of the, are we going to make banana muffins today or strawberry muffins? Which one are we going to make? And you're going to decide some of those things. Children practice some of those ways of doing things. Deb has just pointed out the NAPCAN's release of an updated Convention of the Rights of the Child poster last month. That's absolutely right. It's a great resource. Updated images, really terrific. And she's even put the link in the chat. So those people who are listening later, you can check out the NAPCAN website and have a look at their updated Convention on the Rights of the Child poster. It's a terrific poster, really good to be able to print out. So these three dimensions, if you like, are the probably best way to think about the Convention on the Rights of the Child: survival and development, protection and participation. It doesn't mean to say that just because we've got these ideas doesn't mean to say that every child gets a fantastic the support that they need in their community. It does mean that educators like us and governments and communities and families are all part of the way that we uphold children's rights on a daily basis. So another thing that's really important for us to think about in terms of children's rights is the ways which we understand human rights and children's rights to be enacted. So I want to just clarify this, because sometimes I think that this is a really interesting way of thinking about whose responsibility children's rights are. So if you think about all those collections that I just said before, whose job is it? And one of the things that we know about children's rights is that there is an arc, if you like, a way that we think about it, which covers over the person who holds the rights and the person who has a duty to maintain them or uphold them. And if you like, in the children's rights space, we can think about the children's rights space to be a table. Can you see this image here? A table whereby the child stands on top of the table. And we know that there are various legs of that table that make it stable. So we make it stable when we have a conversation where we collaborate together. And we understand that we are part of the duty bearers. So we have a duty to uphold children's rights, and that children are the rights holder or the recipient of those rights. Now, technically speaking, formally speaking, the person, the group, the organisation, the agency who is ultimately responsible for the Convention on the Rights of the Child are the people who signed it, which happens to be the Australian government. But what we do here in our work is we say, we want to be part of that. We want to accept some duty bearer responsibility. So I feel like we need T-shirts, #duty bearer. I'm a duty bearer in the enactment of children's rights, in the upholding of children's rights. Now, if you've never thought about yourself like that, it's a really good way of thinking about it. Say, I have a duty which I take a little bit, and I say, thanks, I'm going to have a little bit of my duty is to uphold children's rights here in this space. And of course, the Australian government has a broad perspective, but we take a little bit of that through the National Quality Standard into our own family daycare homes. And we say to the rights holder, the child, we will be a duty bearer in this conversation. So it is an interesting thing to think about too when you talk to families. Now, some of you might also talk to families about the children's rights space. If you have, that's fantastic. So keep doing it. It's great to share that idea, but it might not be very clear to families that their child is a rights holder. There might not be a conversation that they've had in their home. And sometimes it's also important to note here that rights do get misinterpreted from time to time. So sometimes families will say to you, well, my child doesn't have a right to decide when they go to bed. That's true, they don't. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that says I have a right to decide when I go to bed or when I clean my teeth or what I eat for breakfast. They're not that right. But what there is the right to be heard. So the right to be a participant member in the decisions that are made that affect you. Now, also, children also have a right to have people to look out for their best interests. So that's the role of the families. Sometimes there is confusion to say that children's rights undermine families' rights. But in fact, that is not the case. What we want to do is say that children's rights rely on families, parents, caregivers, acting in the child's best interest so that they can have a conversation about whether you need your nappy change now or whether you need to go to bed because it's 10:30. So all of those things are important in our conversation with children and their families. So raise those. But I do like the idea of nominating you to be a rights duty bearer. So you take on that responsibility in your local context. You are not responsible for what the Australian government does. You are not responsible for the global conversation. You are responsible for what happens in upholding children's rights in your space, in your home, on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, when it's raining, with every single child who comes to you as a rights holder. And the idea of a rights holder really supports children to have those rights we talk about, protection, survival, development, participation, upheld in your setting. Now, it's really important to know here that some children, because of their family circumstances, might not get all of these rights enacted for them, that they get them with you. They get to feel what it's like to be a rights holder when they're with you. And that is a gift that you can offer to children that is beyond measure. And if children walk out of a family daycare context feeling that they are a rights holder and that then they feel more confident and agentic, they feel a sense of themselves as a rights holder, you know what happens? They don't become arrogant, and they don't become self-centered. They uphold the rights of others. So what we ultimately want in our community is for everybody to feel that they are both a rights holder and a duty bearer. Because when we make sure that our rights are upheld, we want to make sure that everybody else, the other person next to us, also has their rights upheld because rights are not individual. You're not an island. Your rights rely on somebody else's rights also being upheld. So if you've got a right to speak, then so too is the person next to you, which of course is something that our children learn when they're in family daycare. And well done, those people who have actually done a bit of Google searching while we've been online and realised that the US is the one country that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child because of some of the conversations I'm just having right now about the complexity of understanding children's rights as opposed to families' rights and to parents' rights. So that is a bit shocking, I agree. Some of you who said, actually, I wouldn't have thought that would be the case. But yes, indeed, it is the case. One country has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that is the US. Most recently, Somalia signed the convention. A new government was formed, and they did sign the convention in more recent times. So every other country except for the US. It is a really interesting topic of conversation and lots of things that you can search about that and read up more about Australia's track record, which is complex at times. We have some things that we do well and some things that we probably needed to do better in this space, but also to be able to think about what this means in a global context. So I know some of you are thinking about that on a daily basis. But I am really interested in you thinking about your own children's rights story. And for me, I think about this in terms of my grandfather. And this is a picture of me and my sister and my brother. Do you see that we are wearing matching smocked dresses made by my grandmother, in fact? And there's my gorgeous brother in his sailor suit. Very lovely. But one of the things that I think is helpful for us to do is to use reflective practice to think a little bit about our own experience and understanding of children's rights. It's to know about them, but then to bring them back into your own lives and to think about them in terms of children's lives. To make them real, if you like. So one of the things that I like to ask people to do, and you might want to have a little pause, and then when you're taking the dog for a walk a bit later on today, looking after your well-being, you might want to think about, well, what do I know about children's rights, and where did I learn about them, and when did you learn about them, and how do you think your rights were upheld? And I like to think about, I didn't really learn about children's rights until I was starting work as an early childhood professional. It's because it wasn't really talked about before that. We're increasingly talking about it in education context. And I think one of the things that we have an obligation to do under the convention is to make sure that children learn about their own rights. And this is not to, as I said, not to make them arrogant or self-centered, but ensure that they understand what they are and that the person next to them also has the same rights, is the trick. And it is, for me, it's something that I like to reflect on is I remember sitting around a kitchen table in my house, my home that I grew up in with my parents, and my grandfather would come over every Thursday. And he would come over, he'd be there at the after school, we'd all come home, and he brought donuts. I remember that. And he wanted to know everything that had happened to us. He wanted to ask us questions and talk to us about different things and ask, so he talked lots. And I think, if I look back, I think he was upholding my rights. Which rights was he upholding? My right to be heard, my right to be, as a child, to have a voice in matters that affected me, and for him to listen carefully. So one of the things that family daycare educators can do to uphold children's rights is to think about their own experience of where their rights were upheld, and then take them into the context of their work with children. I remember distinctly having a conversation with a family daycare educator who said to me, my dad said to me when I was little, she grew up in the Philippines, and she said, my dad said to me, you can do whatever you want. Don't you let people tell you that because you're a girl, you can't do what you want. And you can't, live the life you want to live, and you can choose who you marry and all those sorts of things. And she said, I remember that conversation, and I think that's your dad upholding your rights. And of course, we don't sort of say it in the moment. It sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But what I want us to do is to reflect on our own experience, to tune into our own experience, and to think about what that might look like. On the other side of this, and this is it's a challenging thing sometimes to think about. Some of you will also be able to identify times when your rights have been eroded and that you felt very strongly about that. If you tune into that, make sure you're kind to yourself, but also just think a little bit about what that was like, and then make sure that it doesn't get enacted in the children that you work with. And it reminds me also of a conversation I had with an educator who said to me, I remember going to school, and she had a Greek heritage, and she had a lunchbox full of delicious food, and she was made fun of, and she remembered by the other children. She remembers a time when the teacher also made fun of her and mocked her for the things that she had in her lunchbox. And she said, I remember that. And she said, that's one of the reasons why I became an early childhood educator, because I didn't want that to ever happen to a child that I worked with. And I thought, yes, that's a fantastic idea. You know what she is? She's a duty bearer and a rights upholder. And I think this is sometimes fantastic for you to think about your own experience of it. It can be sometimes a challenging thing, but often it's about, and there we go. There's someone in the chat, Sue. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly how to say your name, but remember that her grandfather telling her things about being standing strong in who she was. So those sorts of terrific stories that come from your own experience are really worth bringing into the context of family daycare. They are also opportunities whereby you can bring your own experience into the context of your work. Now, of course, for us in the early childhood education and care context, in children's services generally, we are also guided by the guiding principles of the National Quality Framework, which will not be news to you. Remind us that the rights and best interests of children are paramount. So right up the top, right from the get-go, we are being asked to pay attention to children's rights. You can't do that unless you know what they are. You can't do that if you're not thinking about what they look like. So we want to be thinking about what that might look like. Now, I want to talk about one particular right that I think is a really important one, and it is Article 12 of the Convention. So once you get your poster, have a bit of a look about that. And it's this idea that we talk a lot about in early childhood education, which is about the idea of children being able to have agency. So to be able to make decisions in matters that affect them, Article 12 of the Convention. And I want us to increasingly think about what that might look like. It goes to participation rights, so about children's active participation. But it's more than just children choosing between banana muffins and strawberry muffins. It's actually the opportunity for children to exercise authority, so decisions that can change the landscape, and to take an idea and act with initiative, so that they've got ideas and they want to bring them to the table. If they can't do that in family daycare, where can they do them? Now, this little example here wasn't a centre-based setting, but I'm sure you've actually seen something like this in the children that you work with. And it does rely on educators going with children on with their authority and their initiative. And that's what we mean by agency and acting Article 12 out on a daily basis. This little girl wanted to measure things, and her educator found a tape measure. You can see that tape measure there. And she proceeded in measuring everything, including hair and feet and all sorts of interesting things. And the educator really supported her to exercise the authority to be in charge of the tape measure and to also act with initiative. So she had the ideas, and the educator really supported her to continue to think about that. That is Article 12. There it is. So when you work with children who've got an idea, who want to do something, they want to make a box construction that looks like a big building. They want to make a rocket. They want to feed the chickens. They want to understand what it looks like to think about particular aspects of the program that you present. They want to sit in a particular place when they're having lunch, who knows? Then this is an opportunity not only to support children to act with their agency, but to really stretch that out to think about exercising authority. What authorities do they have? Now, of course, children don't have huge amounts of authority. They can't change everything, but they can, within a family daycare context, have some authorities. They can decide some things. Now, you decide what they can decide, but it's also an opportunity for children to experiment about what that feels like. And then we get children to be able to enact those rights so that when they get to be older, they can support other people to have those rights enacted. So learning more about those things in daily practice is a really helpful space for children to be in. I'm conscious of time, but it's really helpful here for us to just take a few more of these ideas into this space and say, what might it look like for children to be able to, I'm moving too far ahead. What does it look like for children in daily practice in family daycare? And I want to just pick up a few of the articles in the convention. There is a very fundamental commitment in the convention to children's right to play. And it's worth noting that Early Childhood Australia, amongst other people, are exploring what it means what play means in a contemporary Australian community and embarking on a year of play to think about that. It's also really important to think about that in terms of the year of COVID. Or the 2 years of COVID that we've had, what does it look like? But what we mean here is the way that you, as family daycare educators, as duty bearers in children's enactment of their rights, allow, open up, provide spaces for children to play. And I'm not talking about free play here necessarily. I'm talking about this really sophisticated idea that we know about in early childhood education, where children are constructing ideas in a voluntary way. They're imagining things. They are coming up with different ideas in the context of their settings. And for many of you, you are taking children out into the communities that they are a part of, and they are connecting with the communities that they're part of and engaging in the natural world to play and use the resources and materials that they see in their local communities to explore different dimensions of their own imagination. And extended periods of time where children can play, uninterrupted, self-directed, self-perpetuating, exploratory, imaginative spaces are what we mean by ensuring children have a right to play. We also mean here that there is less time in formulaic or formalised things. Worksheets are not what we mean by children's right to play. We mean uninterrupted times, collaborative times with other children and you to explore ideas and use resources in imaginative ways. We've seen some fantastic examples in the PD in Your Pocket series where there's some amazing spaces created that help you to understand what it looks like to cultivate children's play. That is a right, have a right to it. And we know it provides children with many opportunities to extend and stretch their thinking. Children also have a right to safety. There is a very strong commitment, protection rights within the context of the convention. And that means that you are going to be mindful about how children cross the road. This is what it looks like on a daily basis. It's about wearing your hat, putting your sunscreen on and crossing the road at the right space, figuring out what your context looks like is about upholding children's right to safety, which is one of the reasons we ask you to do risk assessments. It's one of the reasons we ask you to pay attention to the regulations. It's one of the reasons why we ask you to make sure that children have safe sleep arrangements. It's making sure that there are situations whereby we pay attention to children's allergies. These are all upholding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They are not there just to cause you grief. They are there to be able to uphold every child's right to safety, because children are little in this process and they need the support of a duty bearer to help them understand what it means to be safe. And absolutely, we know that because the right to be safe also goes alongside the right for children to be consulted in matters that affect them, you might want to also bring children increasingly into a space where they are making decisions about what is safe and what is not. So we know that there are lots of family daycare educators out there who are bringing children into the process to write the risk assessment together. Now, that's a fantastic idea. Writing the risk assessment that you're required to do, you have to do that part, but also making sure that supporting children to be able to connect with the ideas of contributing to their own safety as well. Wendy's posted a question in the chat, which we'll come to in a moment, Wendy. I think that they'll pick up on one of the things that we're getting to, so hold that thought. Children have an absolute right to be heard. It's a really important part, Article 12 of the Convention, one that I think is probably one of the ones that we can do the most significant work in. The idea here is that increasingly we give children the opportunity to say what they think. And this is going to be in pedagogical documentation in this sort of image that you can see in front of you, where you write down some of the things that children have ideas about. That's why I like the floor book idea, or the idea of having a big book like this actually gives you an opportunity to write down some of the things that children are thinking about. But I also want to encourage you to actually think about the ways in which you might take problems to children, or difficulties, that some things that are tricky that you might want to sort out with children. And I love the idea of sharing some of those tricky things. We can't do this, so what are we going to do? Can we solve this problem together, and can we figure out a way forward? I was talking to a group of educators in Canberra the other day, and they told me that they'd been out and about walking around, and this is certainly something that our family daycare colleagues do all of the time, and the children came across a lot of rubbish that had been blown, that had some really rainy days, and the rubbish had been sort of washed into this area, and it was in a natural area, and the children were a bit cross about it. They were like a bit, it's not right. And they couldn't understand why people just left rubbish, and they were just talking a little bit about this. Now, an educator who's mindful of children's rights can say, actually, this is an opportunity for children's rights to be heard, right to be upheld, and for children's right to be heard to be enacted. So what she did was have a conversation with the children about their voices and their ideas and what they were going to do about it. And this has led to a huge conversation with children, and they've gone back and forth to that same park, so that they're having conversations about what they're going to do about it. They've noted some things down. They've written a letter. There's all these different things happening, because children, as our youngest citizens, have a right to be heard. Family daycare educators can make that happen. You can give children that right. Now, sometimes in their own homes, this is not as much the case. Now, we want to promote that idea more broadly, but we do want to say here in family daycare, we give children the right to be heard. Now, it doesn't mean, as I said before, that children get a right to decide whether they want their nappy changed or not. They get a right to say whether they're ready for that, but they don't necessarily, because they might, they need their nappy changed, and that's your duty of care to them and your responsibility as an educator who maintains their safety. But the children have a right to be saying, yes, I'm ready, or no, I'm not quite, and giving children some opportunities. And you can see that that's complex thinking, but it's a really important way for us to be able to enact children's rights in that context. So it really is a powerful way for us to be able to enact that. And some of you have got lots of different strategies and techniques that you use to be able to enact that. Some of you using digital platforms to share those ideas. Some of you using recordings. Some children are making movies and sharing those things with their families. So lots of different opinions and ideas being shared about from what children think about the world in which they live, from rubbish in the park to a whole range of different things that you might be doing in your own family daycare context. Children also have a right to a family, and this is a really important part of this, and it's something that we make a very strong commitment to in early childhood education. Children have a right to a family that supports them, and sometimes in our context of our Australian community, we need to take action to support children whose families are not keeping them safe, and that's in that child protection space that some of you know well. But other times it is about making sure that children's family is honoured and respected. So this is one of the reasons why we say in the principles that children have a right that their families are understood as their child's most important teacher, and that we honour and respect them. So how do we do that on a daily basis? We actually speak and talk to families. And, as you speak to them on a daily basis, twice a day. You get to speak to them all the time as you progress with them, and honouring and supporting who they are in the context of our lives and children's lives is really important. In fact, we want to help children feel proud of their families, and a deep respect for their families is important. That something we can do as family daycare educators to uphold children's right to a family. And this means, and let me just be really practical here, it means that you might be feeling very challenged by a family. You might think they're asking me to do something that I'm not really comfortable with, or I find that a challenge. In fact, this goes to Wendy, your question that you've posed here. What happens if a family says to you that we want a situation where the boys don't have to clean up, or the boys, boys can do these things and girls can't do this thing, and you're feeling very challenged by that? It's important that when our conversation with children about their families is highly respectful. So no dissing the family in front of children. We want to make sure that we are respectful and honouring of who families are. You don't always have to agree with what families bring to you, and that some of the ideas might be challenging, but with children, we uphold and respect children's right to their family as part of who they are and part of their right. But let's go to the question around cultural understandings and different perspectives. These are some amazing dancers in Federation Square at Diwali this year. And so some of our little celebrations that have happened in our culturally really diverse communities across Australia. And I know many of you were celebrating Diwali probably in your own homes. So and do so with many, many cultural events from families. But every single child has a right to a culture. Now, remember that culture is defined not necessarily as the celebrations, although it could be celebrations, but it's a whole range of little tiny things that form who you are and how you live your life. And children do have a right to be able to have their cultural identity honoured and respected. And this means their linguistic identity, their right to language, and their right to their culture. Now, it is absolutely true that some of the cultural experiences that families might undertake in their own homes might differ very strongly from what you believe in. And say, for example, the idea about boys might do this and girls might do this. This is something we would respect from families' perspective, so that we respect their choices as long as they are within the law, and that they keep children safe and uphold children. But in our context, we might have to have conversations with families to say, we really understand that that's an important part of your family, that boys may be not responsible for certain things or girls do certain things. But here in this family daycare setting, in relation to the expectations of the National Quality Standard and the National Quality Framework and My Time, Our Place and Belonging, Being and Becoming, we are obliged to treat all children fairly and equitably, and we would promote gender equality. So one of the great things about the frameworks that we have as part of our world is that we can use some of those things to promote different conversations with families. If you feel like that's going to be a problem, that you want to uphold children's rights in a particular way and families want to not do that, then it's important that you open up a conversation with families, because at some point families might say, I don't want to be part of a program like this and I'm going to take my children somewhere else, which is fine. They can make that decision about because every child has a right to their culture and their families, and it might be different from yours. So compatibility and figuring out how you can sit together with this by being upfront about some of the things that you believe in, your philosophy, and the things that you hold important early in the conversation really help this conversation to progress. It's a really good question. Probably we could talk about it for another 3 days, but every single child has a right to a culture, which means that on a daily basis, we want to support children to speak in their first language. We want to support children to celebrate whatever's going on in their own family. It might be their grand final. It might be Diwali. It might be Christmas coming up. Who knows? But they have an opportunity to celebrate those things which are important to them in their context. And one of the ways we do that, of course, is by asking their family about what's important to them. You'll be surprised. I'm always surprised by this. Families sometimes will talk about their own cultural identity, and they will say their cultural identity is very broad, because in the Australian community, we incorporate lots of traditional cultural aspects, but we also take on new ones. And it's become lots of different traditions and ceremonies and routines and rituals that help people build their lives. And that's what culture is about. You often don't realize you're in it until you're out of it. So children have a right to those things, and they have a right that the duty bearer upholds the right of children to access that culture. The other thing that's interesting about this too, and has been sort of explored broadly in early childhood education, is children also have a right to know about other people's cultures. So they know about what's going on in the cultural context. So to have their own upheld, but also know about the other ones that are around them, which of course is something that you can do within the family daycare context on a really beautiful way, because you're in people's homes, you're in your home, so you can actually share that with children in a really meaningful and powerful way. So here's my challenge to you as we finish. What I want to invite you to do is to think a little bit about these 5 aspects of children's rights in practice. I want you to be thinking here about, how can I as a duty bearer offer children the opportunity to be heard, to be healthy, to be safe, to play, and have their culture valued. You could go more broadly, but I think these are a really good invitation for you to think about what this might look like. And I just want to leave you here by saying that you can do this in very concrete ways. When you commit to children's right to be heard, you have to stop and listen. Talk less, listen more. When you commit to children being healthy, you promote healthy choices in children's meal times, in sunscreen, wearing your hat, putting your helmet on, all those different things. And being safe is very much connected to that. Thinking about the ways you protect children and teach them about being safe when they go out and about crossing the roads. The right to play, educators provide space and time for play, and that is unhurried and supported by you as the early childhood professional. Children have the right to be valued. Educators respect children's culture and their language, and they are interested and engaged in those ideas. Actually, it's interesting because you look at this list and you think, actually, I could plan a program around that. I could actually plan how to develop a whole family daycare program right around children's right to be heard, children's right to be safe, children's right to be healthy, children's right to play, and children's right to have their culture valued. There's lots more you can investigate in this space, and it's really interesting, and I would encourage you to continue to think in this way, because you as a duty bearer can really help children to understand what it means to be a rights holder, so that when they are 25, they enact a sense of rights and duty bearer responsibilities for the people that they work with when they're 25. And it could be us when we're in aged care facilities. So we've got a vested interest in this process. And can I leave you with some doctored words of Moira Rayner from 2002? She's an amazing advocate for children's rights, and she's done some really strong thinking about what it means. As you leave this meeting, remember that children in our refugee camps and our places in various contexts around the world came here on fragile boats buoyed by hope. And remember that we too are in a situation where we can uphold children's rights. Think of what they left behind and think of what they hoped for when they came here and what they saw in us, a land of hope and opportunity and compassion, which we are, but will not allow ourselves to be at times. So when you get home, think about the children whose rights are being eroded in various parts of our community across the globe, and think about the ways in which we can celebrate and support children's rights in the work we do. Think of yourself as an ambassador who can speak on their behalf in your own tongue, that you are their fellow citizens in a republic of conscience. Your embassies are everywhere, in family daycare contexts everywhere around the country, and you operate independently, and no such ambassadors will ever be relieved. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that you take on the challenge of being strong advocates and duty bearers for children's rights. Thanks very much, Rochelle.
Thank you so much, Catherine. How wonderful. I really, that's going to stay with me forever now, duty bearer. Hashtag duty bearer on our t-shirt.
Let's get t-shirts.
You know, I love the idea of children contributing to the risk assessments and becoming their own duty bearers, really. That was wonderful. And, you know, reminding us to refer to our guiding documents to uphold their rights. It was fantastic. Thank you. Wonderful.